Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this IRMS North bi-weekly webinar session. I hope you're all doing well. The topic for today is Records and Governance in Microsoft Teams. Your speaker is Robert Bath, the new IRMS Digital Director. My name is Iram Ditter and I'm the North Group Chair. When I'm not acting as Group Chair, I'm an Information Governance Operations Lead at law firm Latham & Watkins in Manchester. Latham & Watkins is an international law firm which employs over 3,000 lawyers worldwide. Just a bit of housekeeping before I call on stage our speaker today. So you're all muted by default. I will be your moderator for this session. If you want to chat with me or the other attendees today, then please use the chat function to the right of your screen if you have this display maximized. If not, and it's minimized, it will be to the bottom of your screen. If you want to direct specific questions to either Rob or I, then please use the question function, again, to the right of your screen or the bottom on the second pane. And as a moderator, I will direct any questions for response using the live answer function, whereby you'll see the question pop onto the screen and then be answered by either Rob or I. Please also take some time during this webinar to complete the poll under the poll section. In that section, there is a poll right now where I'm just trying to elicit some feedback on whether or not you are an IRMS member. The information will be completely confidential, so it will not be stored on any other system aside from Livestorm. Please take some time to do that, either at the start or the end of this session. I hope you enjoy this session. If you have any comments or feedback that you'd like to share with Rob or I directly, then please do not hesitate to email me at north@irms.org.uk. I'll now hand you over to our speaker, Rob. Rob, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. It's good to see so many people here. I mean, this session was actually run for the public sector group back on the 20th of last month. So to see such a healthy attendance for a repeated session, I'm really pleased. So thanks for introducing me. Do hope everyone can see the slides, etc. Mention in the chat if there's anything that you can't hear or can't see. I am Robert Bath. I am, as rightly introduced, as of yesterday, I've stepped up to become the digital director for the IRMS. In my day job, I'm a Microsoft 365 solution architect working for a company called Intelogy, as you see on the screen. And effectively what I've done is I've worked on nothing but SharePoint and Office 365 for, gosh, more than a decade now. And for the last 5 years or so have pretty exclusively focused upon information governance, information compliance, and especially records management inside SharePoint and Office 365. Now, a little bit of a plug before I jump into the session, but I recognize that there's quite a few people here today and that not everyone is an IRMS member. You know, now I'm in the exec of the IRMS. I guess my message is slightly different, but it's slightly more biased, I guess. But honestly, the reason I've chosen to volunteer for the executive of the IRMS and give up some of my free time is effectively because I think the organisation provides such excellent value for its members. You know, you've got a brilliant in-house magazine, bulletin, and you've also got so many of these events, just, well, the event that we're in right now, that are run up and down the country and are free to members to attend. Obviously, this one's been brought online for given reasons, but I encourage anyone who's not already a member to seriously consider joining the IRMS. It's great value for money. So in today's session, what I'm going to be looking at is effectively trying to provide everyone with an overview of Teams. I mean, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with Teams. You're probably in situations where many of you have already started using Teams in earnest in your organization. I mean, we've seen a massive boom in use of Teams around the world in the last few months for obvious reasons. At the beginning of the year, Microsoft were reporting around 30 million active users in Teams. And that number has significantly increased to 72 million reported in April. So, you know, leaps and bounds in terms of Teams usage. Now, Teams is great. I absolutely love Teams. You know, it's a brilliant collaboration tool. But what I find is that there's not a lot of people paying attention to the governance and retention aspects. And that's really what I want to focus on today. How do we actually make sure that the information we're storing inside Teams, all of that information we're creating on a daily basis, is actually going to be information that we can manage and maintain into the future? So let's jump into it. So at a high level, I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with this already, but what is Teams? Well, really it's, to me, an amalgamation of communication features and collaboration features that are sort of brought together into a single, I guess you could call it digital workplace, a space where everyone can access and work together rather than having to jump between lots of disparate applications to get on with your job. It's growing all the time as well. So in terms of its coverage, it's constantly evolving to incorporate more parts of Microsoft 365 and pull them together into a single space. I think it's really important to get a look back at almost where Teams has come from. Now, I'm going to be slightly guessing because, you know, some of this thinking's going on behind closed doors. But from my point of view, it's fairly clear to me that that Teams really has come from Microsoft's Exchange team. So when the Exchange team was starting to think about Microsoft 365, you could almost imagine the conversation that they were having. You know, up until that point, Exchange and Outlook had been installed by different organizations around the world on their own hardware. And suddenly when Microsoft started pulling it all into the cloud, what you've got is a situation where all of that volume of email and all of the volume of attachments is being pulled in and stored now on large data centers hosted by Microsoft. And so that concern of how much content is being stored, the actual physical costs of paying for all of those servers are now being sort of centralized on Microsoft. So you can sort of imagine the thinking going along the lines of, oh gosh, how do we encourage people to perhaps email a little bit less and store a little bit less content inside Exchange? Now, the obvious place to start would have been attachments. I'm sure many of you realize that when you attach a file to an email, you are taking a copy of that file and you're almost pushing out another copy to every single recipient. So let's say you attach a copy of a file to an email and send it to 10 people. If they're all internal to your organization, you're going to suddenly have 11 copies of that file stored inside Exchange. And if one of those people replies to the message, you can imagine it becomes exponential in terms of the volume of data that's being stored in the servers. So Microsoft started thinking, well, it'd be really good if we could basically not do that. Get people working on a single copy of that file instead. So we take the attachment and we put it somewhere in Office 365 and then get everyone, instead of working on separate copies, to work on one single shared version of the truth. And that also stops the issue of, you know, different sort of merging of different variations of the same file that would often happen at the end of an email conversation. Now, where do we store this this file that we've now got? Because Exchange doesn't really have a file storage space. But SharePoint does. So you can almost imagine they turned around to the SharePoint team. Now, originally they looked at OneDrive. I admit it was originally OneDrive was spun up behind the scenes, but OneDrive is essentially SharePoint anyway. They looked at the file storage capabilities in SharePoint and said, we've got the perfect solution. Every time someone attaches something, we can easily store it in SharePoint, and then all of the people who've received that attachment can access SharePoint. But this introduced another potential headache in that they needed to have some way of ensuring that the people who were able to access the email exchange were the only people who could also access the file. In other words, you didn't really want to just expose the file to anyone in SharePoint. You needed to restrict the permissions to a certain group of people. And this really is where the groups concept, what was previously called the Office 365 groups, now called the Microsoft 365 groups concept, came from. And this really is a group of users who are given permission to access both the file that's stored in the SharePoint site and simultaneously given access to the inbox, a shared inbox in Exchange and a shared calendar in Exchange. So this one group, one permission group almost provides access to multiple bits of content in different spaces, making it really easy to manage permissions. And you can imagine that the conversations, this initial nugget, if you like, of a concept of groups started evolving itself. And the obvious place that it turned was to Skype for Business. Because, of course, Skype for Business is now being replaced by Teams itself, and all of the function, there's not going to be another version of Skype for Business, as many of us know, but Teams is the replacement for Skype for Business, and all of the functionality of Skype, the video calls and the instant messages, effectively, they were all, if you think about it, they're all ways of helping to firstly reduce the number of emails that are being sent around inside an organization, but they're also really good tools for getting a team working together. And if you've got this concept of already having this group of people who have shared files and shared emails, then why not actually have persistent conversations stored by effectively the Skype for Business functionality? So you almost build this shared one workplace for that group of people. Now, obviously, I don't know the details of all the conversations that happen behind the scenes in Microsoft, but I can imagine that this really is where Teams came from. And you can still see the remnants of all of the functions, if you like, that came from different parts of Microsoft 365 in the functions that you see in Teams. So you can see, for example, the calendar is clearly, it is the Outlook calendar that you're seeing. You are seeing that functionality pulled over from Exchange. And that's essential in Teams because it helps you book those meetings in order to have the video calls and the conference calls. You've also got the conference calls themselves, the chat, and also the posts are all coming from Skype for Business, as was. And of course, the file storage, as we've seen, is all coming from SharePoint. And very recently, we've seen the incorporation of Yammer as well. So you can start seeing that there's different parts of Microsoft 365 are all being brought together into this single central digital workspace that really helps people get on and collaborate and communicate really effectively. And as I say, I really love it. It's the retention and compliance that goes behind all of that information that I really think we need to focus on. So you might have noticed in the previous slide, I didn't highlight this Teams space. Teams really is the central bucket within Teams. And inside Teams, you've got lots of things that are referred to as teams. So here we have an example of Project Alpha, COVID response, and finance department. These are just example teams that I've created inside the Teams section of Microsoft Teams. Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. I really wish there was a different wording or different naming here to actually make it easy to understand what you're referring to, because sometimes when I say Teams, it's hard for people to understand whether I'm talking about the whole application or just the Teams section of Teams, or even just an individual team within the Teams section of Teams. Fun. But importantly to know, you can create a whole bunch of different teams inside Teams. And each of those teams effectively provides a separate workspace with a separate group behind the scenes of people who have access to that workspace. Inside each team, you've got a bunch of channels. So probably best to look at the Project Alpha team up here. You can imagine that a single project, whatever it happens to be related to, is going to have multiple different sort of strands. Perhaps it's project reporting, perhaps it's research and development, that are all pulling together to make that project happen. And all members of the team will be able to view all of these different strands. We'll get onto private channels in a bit, but each of these is referred to as a channel. And what's important is that the channels themselves are where you see these top two links, posts and files. So each channel provides you with access to posts and to files. And you'll also notice there's Wiki there as well. I've covered up slightly. Wiki there's other functions you can bolt on to each channel. And wikis are a perfect example. I'm not going to go into them in any real detail today, but you can imagine you can bolt on other functions as well. So you could, for example, pull a plan from Planner in as a separate tab. You could pull in custom processes, etc., into separate tabs in specific channels. So there's huge, capability to expand what you've actually got there out of the box. But let's just look at posts and files, because I think they're the two sort of critical parts of each channel. Posts provide you with effectively a wall. You've probably all seen this. This is where you have persistent messages for a given channel. The idea here is you can, upload files, you can mention people, you can have those conversations, and importantly, you can go back and refer to those conversations, a bit like the old Facebook wall, the way you can actually scroll back and actually look at what happened in the past before they started juggling it all up and you can never find things again. But the post side, the wall side, if you like, of the persistent conversation for each channel is really powerful in terms of having that team conversation. The files side, as you can imagine, contains files. And the files that you see in the Files tab of Teams are actually stored behind the scenes inside SharePoint. I'm sure many of you already realize that, but what you're looking at here are files that are technically stored in a SharePoint site that are being surfaced through the team interface. But it means that obviously from a compliance retention point of view, when you're thinking about Teams, you have to think about both the files and also content that's being stored in chat and posts, etc. Now, I alluded to this before. So the channels that we spoke about, so for example, these ones under Project Alpha up here, project reports, R&D, etc. These are all channels that are shared with all members of the team. There's a concept of private channels, which I won't go into too much detail, but effectively it allows you to have a channel that is almost locked from some members of the team, and only a subset of the people inside the team have access to the private channel. Now, what I will say is that many of the compliance and governance features that we will discuss today don't fully work or need to be worked in a different way when it comes to private channels. Technically, the private channel, each private channel that's created is a separate SharePoint site underneath the scenes. So while, let's say, general project reports, R&D, and timelines might all be in one SharePoint project site for Project Alpha, each private channel that's created inside Project Alpha would have a separate SharePoint site underneath the hood and needs to be maintained and managed with a bit more nuance. Than, I think that's a further discussion for a later day. So we've seen that there's lots of different teams inside Teams. You saw Project Alpha, for example, as an example of a team. But there are actually 3 different types of team. So you can pick when you're choosing to create a team, which type of team you want to create. By and large, most organizations tend to use private teams almost exclusively. It might be different in your organization. Certainly, I think the larger you get as an organization, the more likely it is that you're going to be using private teams more often. So let's go through each of these. Org-wide teams, everyone inside the organization can see and edit all of the content in that team. It's only available if you've got less than 5,000 people in the organization. But it's, I guess the fact that everyone can edit as well as see means it's not really a distribution mechanism. It's more for an organization that trusts and empowers people to share and collaborate and allows them to delete the content that's stored in that org-wide team. The public team. So anyone in the organization can see a public team. You can search for the public team, and anyone in the organization can add themselves as a member of that public team. It's basically a sort of opt-in, opt-out process. So it's great for, let's say, something where you don't really mind whether or not individuals decide whether they're in the team or not. So let's say you've got a social committee, I don't know, a hockey team or something at work. It might be a great place for something like that because you don't really care who's in or who's out. It's not sensitive information. It's not critical that certain people are part of the team. Public teams give the flexibility for people to sort of drift in and out of the team as they see fit. Again, in a larger organization, once you're talking about multiple offices, perhaps geographically dispersed, perhaps even a multinational organization, you're seeing lots of these public teams. It's going to start becoming overwhelming to work out which ones you should be in and which ones you shouldn't be in. So typically, public teams are used more by smaller organizations. And that leaves us with private teams. I would say the majority of teams that I see on a day-to-day basis, certainly in any organization with, let's say, more than 100 or so staff, tends to be a private team. Each private team has a team owner, or well, all the teams have owners, but effectively with private teams, the owner is more empowered. And that's because they are responsible for almost deciding who's in the team and who's not. Now, there's 2 types of private team. You either have discoverable private teams, in which case anyone in the organization can search and find the team, and they can then request access to that team. And the team owner is empowered to decide whether or not they actually have access to the team. Or there's non-discoverable teams. And these are really your sort of secret squirrel teams. So with a non-discoverable team, you can search for it. It's not going to show up. The only way you're ever going to find that team is if the owner pulls you in and says, right, you're coming into this team. So you can almost imagine, again, that in many organizations, the non-discoverable teams are reserved for the secret stuff that needs to be sort of isolated from everyone else. But for some organizations, especially when they're a bit concerned about people making requests, the volume of teams, you might find a very large organization almost uses more of these non-discoverable teams than perhaps a medium-sized organization would. But by and large, probably discoverable private teams are what most organizations will be using, is my guess. Right. So let's look at the permissions model inside Teams. And honestly, the Teams permission model is great. It's really simple. No one likes talking about permissions, but Teams boils it right down to just two groups. You have owners and you have members. The owners, as we've seen, the team owner really is, they administrate the team. They've got control over all of the settings of the team that are stored at the team level, and they can choose who's a member of the team, so that they're really empowered. The members of the team have the ability to view everything in the team, private channels aside. They've also got the ability to edit any of the files in the team, or edit any of their own posts on the wall of the team, or any of the walls of any of the channels. And likewise, the members all have the ability to delete any file in the team and delete any of their own posts or messages in the team. So one thing to just stress here is there is no concept of a read-only team. Teams are always, by nature, all members of the team have the ability to add, edit, and delete. And I guess one thing I find interesting is the relationship between the team and the underpinning SharePoint site. Because what you've got is SharePoint has a much more complicated permission model. I mean, this is just inferring. You can actually take this out of the box permission model and extend it quite significantly. But what Microsoft's done is they've taken the owners group from the team and injected them as site collection administrators. And they've taken the members group from the team and injected them as members in the SharePoint site. Now, you don't have to really understand what this means, but if you think about this from a SharePoint architectural term, the site collection administrator really is very empowered. They are really quite bombastic in terms of what they can do. They can do anything with that site. They can delete the site. So your owners of a team, who might typically be, I don't know, a project manager or something similar to that, are being given really, really powerful permissions behind the scenes by default to oversee and administrate the SharePoint site. Likewise, your members are being granted the ability to come into the members group here, and the members group in the SharePoint site actually gives them the ability to edit. So it sounds very similar to the powers they have inside the SharePoint inside the team. But actually, the edit permission in SharePoint gives them even more. They can not only add, edit, and delete content. Someone with the ability to edit, in other words, everyone who's in the team, also has the ability to add new document libraries, delete new document libraries. So they can't delete the out-of-the-box library that comes with the team, but certainly if you've added additional document libraries to the team, anyone can delete it all down, including all of its contents. So it's just worth bearing in mind. Okay, moving on. Now, this might look like the most boring slide in this presentation, and possibly it is, but I think it's possibly one of the most important as well, and that's naming conventions. Because to me, teams are almost just that there is no structure. There is no hierarchy behind teams. There's no way of easily saying these group of teams belong to this department or this business unit or this whole part of the organization. There's no easy way of dividing your tenancy up and understanding who owns what. And that's where naming conventions to me become critical. They can help you define certainly the ownership, but in terms of departmental ownership as opposed to the individuals who own the team. But they can also potentially be used to, I don't know, infer the purpose of a team. Is this a project? Is it a department? Maybe even the value of the team. So there's lots of things you could inject into the name of the team in order to allow you to manage it more consistently down the line. Now, out of the box, Microsoft provides something called the group's naming policy. Now, I say out of the box, it actually requires an Azure Active Directory Premium P1 license or an Azure Active Directory Basic EDU license. Yeah, a mouthful, but licensing is always fun in Microsoft 365. Now, what does this do? Well, this group's naming policy gives you the ability to apply fixed words to either the suffix or the prefix, or attributes pulled from Active Directory, potentially the department, appended to the suffix or prefix of each team that is requested and created. I'm less clear about fixed words myself. You know, if it's a consistent word across all of your teams, it doesn't seem to be offering a huge amount of value to me, but the attributes part side I think is really quite powerful. You've also got some ability with this group's naming policy of restricting the names that are given for each workspace. And again, I think this is quite important because you've got the ability to make a central list of blocked words and basically say, no, you can't use any of these terms when you're naming your team. And obviously you could use that for all sorts of expletives, etc. But I guess the way to look at this is what happens if you do nothing here. A great example is, let's imagine, I don't know, someone in your organization is doing a research project and just decides to create, they're doing research into different marketing techniques or something, and they call their team marketing. They might well create that team before the marketing department in your organization actually gets around to requesting and creating a team for marketing. And of course, it's first come, first served out of the box. The first name that is created is the name that's given. Now, to me, it's much better if the person requesting the marketing project, perhaps if it was related to a research project or something itself, and that was appended to the prefix, it would preserve the name of the team for the department when they subsequently come along. So I think it will give you a lot of value to go down this route and make sure you have some form of naming convention. Now, the group's naming policy that's provided by Microsoft isn't the only way of doing this. And I personally think that it's probably not the way I'd choose to do this, because if you, we'll come on to this later, but if you actually create your teams through a consistent process where there is a process for requesting, approving, and creating teams, then as part of that process, you can append exactly the prefixes you need that relate to your organization. And that gives you a lot more control over the actual name that each team is given, and of course over how you maintain it in the future. So if you're not doing it, I would suggest getting some form of naming convention going for your teams. Now, one of the functions that Microsoft Teams provides is the concept of expiration. Now, this is, I think whenever I explain this function to people, most IT people rub their hands with glee because this is brilliant from their point of view. They absolutely love Teams expiration. I think from a compliance point of view, it's perhaps a little bit more nuanced. I think there could be some benefits to looking into Teams expiration, but it's also probably something to be very aware of because the conversation could well come up when you're talking to your IT team. But effectively, Teams expiration gives you the ability to automatically delete teams that aren't currently being used. In other words, you can set a group expiration policy and you can apply it to specific teams. And what this does is, after a certain duration, when the team's just not being used for a period of time, it will automatically notify the owners of that team and say, hey, this team's about to be deleted down. Is it still being used? And if they choose not to actually, respond to that and say, yes, I'm still using this, then of course the team will be deleted down behind the scenes by an automated process. Now, that's brilliant. Certainly with my IT cap on, that's brilliant. We're getting rid of all the content that no one's looking at. But certainly if I think about this from a retention point of view, I start thinking about scenarios, say, the example I always use is when someone drills through a wall and hits some asbestos. No one's going to be viewing that content on a regular basis. I'm not sure you'd want to store it in Teams in the first place, but that's a different point aside. But, if it is stored in Teams, you're going to need to retain that content as an organization, irrespective of whether people are actively viewing it or editing it. It is important information for your organization to retain. So it's just worth bearing in mind that actually just because no one's looking at the content doesn't mean it has no value. But still, this is a tool in the arsenal of Microsoft Teams that you could choose to use, and certainly I can imagine many organizations will make use of this. Okay, getting straight into the next thing is archival. Now, I don't want you to confuse the archival that's in Teams with the archival that many people in information management talk about. This is not the same as sort of moving the content in the team to a more permanent archive where it's almost preserved. This is very much about, I guess, hiding the team, so it's less obvious to see. So effectively, what archival does as a concept in Microsoft Teams is just allow the team owner to choose to archive their team. And all this does is makes the team read-only, and it gives them an option to make the associated SharePoint site behind the team read-only as well. And effectively, it's just removing permissions. It hides the team from the left-hand navigation in Teams, so you don't see an archived team. But all users who are members of the team can still find that team. It's just an archive team. They can just view the content in it. Now, importantly, as an owner of a team, you can also restore an archived team as well. So it's not really a permanent archive. You can, it's just almost like a temporary read-only. Now, if I think about this from a collaboration point of view, this is brilliant. My project Epsilon here, I can effectively start up the project. I can use the project. And when the project comes to an end, I can basically archive that project down. No one can change the files. They're not cluttering up the left navigation for people, and they can get on with other work. And if that project comes back and starts up again, potentially I can unarchive, restore that given team and keep going. So from a collaboration point of view, I think it's a really clean, really good story. It makes it really easy for teams to work together. But I guess from an archival point of view, from a retention point of view, it's probably worth just bearing in mind that it's not a permanent archive. It could be a useful tool to supplement part of a larger story, I guess, around archival. Okay, let's move on. Probably one of the most interesting parts of this for me is retention inside Teams. Teams has never been designed as a records management solution. It's not built from that purpose. It's all about that collaboration and the communication. However, Microsoft 365 provides a whole wealth of really quite powerful records management tools that can be applied across content in various different containers, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. And included in that mix is Teams. So you can apply retention to the content that's in Teams. Now, the reason I've returned to an earlier slide here and showing you Skype for Business and SharePoint logos again is effectively because really there's a difference in the way that retention is applied to the content based upon where which application that content is coming from. So the legacy sort of Skype for Business functionality can only really be protected by retention policies. So that's anything in the chat or in the posts. But anything that's stored in SharePoint, you've got more flexibility. You can use either retention labels or retention policies. So you've got a lot more flexibility on the file side of things, but you've still got capabilities in the chat and posts side of things. So let's actually dive into more detail on precisely the differences between these two approaches and how they apply to posts and files. So within the context of chats and posts, effectively, you apply retention to either everything in the whole team. So all of the posts on all of the walls in all of the channels on the team. Again, this is one of those areas where you've got to pay special attention if you're using private channels. But also, if it's for chats, sort of instant messaging chats that are outside of the context of the team, then effectively you're doing it by person. So this could be really good for, let's say, picking certain people in your organization. Let's say your finance director, and it will preserve every single message that they have sent. Whether it happens to be a relevant message or not is a different question. But the idea is the retention policies that you get in chats and posts are a really broad bucket approach. They give you a very high level control, but they don't have huge fidelity. Whereas inside files with retention labels, you get significantly more options, in my view, when it comes to actually how you apply retention to the content. So first of these, manual labeling. Each file can be individually tagged with a retention label. Now, yes, I know no one actually does that in reality. There's very few people I've ever seen who ever enjoy systematically classifying things, especially when you're not forced to do so because there's no way of making it mandatory, which is quite frustrating. But the fact still remains that you can choose to have two files sat next to each other inside effectively the same team. They're in the SharePoint site behind it, but both those two files could have different retention applied to them. More useful to me is this default values option, because with default values, you can effectively take a container. That container could be, let's say, the whole of a channel, and all of the files that are stored in that channel could automatically get their retention applied to them, and effectively get a retention label applied to them just as soon as they're uploaded into that given channel. So that's quite powerful, because it means you could almost start off, let's say, a project and have everything in your project finances tagged with, I don't know, 7-year retention, and everything that's in your project reporting with a different retention period applied by default. And that means that people only have to manually tag the labels and manually classify things where it's an exception and not as part of the default process. And last but not least, if you're lucky enough to have an advanced license, I should mention that the default values, by the way, it's a grey area as to the license that this is involved in at the moment. I'm not entirely sure. I've seen it available as low as Business Essentials, and I get the impression that it might be, based on a presentation that Joanne Klein delivered last November, might be being up licensed to E5 and a more premium license. But I've asked Microsoft the question directly, and they haven't responded to me several times. So I don't actually know for sure where the license that's behind default values at this point in time, which is frustrating. But what I will say is the automatic retention labels are at a more premium license. They are E5 or equivalent, or one of the add-on licenses. There's a whole list of them I could go through at some point if people are interested. But effectively, there's 3 different types of automatic retention label. You can use matching phrases. So if you happen to have a whole bunch of documents that, let's say, consistently use the same phrase of keywords, then great. But you've got to make sure that consistent phrase is both, I guess, both accurate enough that it's always going to capture the files you need it to, match, but at the same time, sort of obscure enough that it's not going to accidentally pick up too many false positives. But it's worth using as well. It's worth considering as part of a process. You've also got sensitive information types as another concept for automated application of retention labels. Sensitive information types allow you to do sort of advanced pattern matching on things such as credit card numbers, or the French passport number, or something like that, a consistent coded number. And you can almost scan all of the content across SharePoint, Office 365, OneDrive, Teams, and if you find certain types of patterned PII, where you can then apply specific retention to those files. And last but not least, you've got a concept called trainable classifiers, which is an automated way of applying retention to content. And trainable classifiers really only started coming out towards the end of last year, and they're still arriving. But it's really machine learning, it's AI-driven application of retention labels. The idea here is you almost take a group of similar documents. I believe you need a set of, let's say, about 50 of them to seed the AI. But the idea is you almost train Office 365 to learn positive correlation between those 50-odd documents, and then it gets the confidence to start to automatically say, oh, well, it looks like a policy like those other 50 policies you trained me to identify. I'm going to automatically tag this as being a policy. You see where I'm going. Again, it's a premium feature. It's a great thing, and I'd love to get the opportunity to play with it in more detail. It's one of those areas that I need to find 50 good documents to train it and test it myself. Let's look at this. So start times of retention periods. It's nice and simple with chats and posts. You've got 2 options. It's when the post or chat was first created, or when it was last changed. Don't forget, any user can edit any of their posts that they've created inside a team, or any of the instant messages you've sent as well. So you can choose to start retention on either of those 2. You've got the same 2 options with files, but you get more options as well. You could also choose to start retention at the point that a file is labeled, which, yeah, I can see some uses in some scenarios. I was having a good chat with Graham Snow, who often speaks for the IRMS as well, about how this could potentially be used. And there's some situations, let's say archival situations, where you might well have labels being applied when content's moved into certain containers. So it's almost perhaps locking things down at the point that it's labeled, or starting retention at the point it's labeled. But the one I'm more interested in myself is based on an event, because I think you can really thread together some really quite dynamic and interesting scenarios using event-driven retention. I wrote a blog on this recently. You can find it on Intelogy's website, like the company I work for, if you're interested in event-driven retention. But what it does is, imagine the scenario of, let's say, a project closing. Your project might be across multiple teams, multiple places in SharePoint, and have content in lots of places. If you've got your structure seeded with, let's say, a project ID applied to all of those files consistently somehow, and again, it could be through default values, and you've got them with labels applied, you can have a single sort of trigger that closes, let's say, the end of the project, that will then ripple through all the areas of Office 365 and start retention on all content that relates to that event. I think the example I used in my blog post was actually around a housing authority. Let's say a tenant leaves the authority and moves out of one of your houses. You could ripple through all of the different parts of the authority. Let's say the maintenance folders, or the payment folders, and start finding everything that relates to that given tenant who's now leaving, and trigger the start of retention against that event. Really powerful stuff in my mind. When content is subject to retention, so in the middle of the retention period, chats and posts effectively can continue to be edited. Notice there is no concept with the retention policy of immutability. Chats and posts can also be deleted. So as a user, I can go in and delete any of my chats or posts. What users possibly don't realize is behind the scenes, there's like a big bucket safety net that catches everything that's deleted that's subject to that retention policy. So pros and cons on that. It's very, retention policies are very light touch. So as a user, I don't really even know they're in place. But as you can imagine, it's a double-edged sword. You know, I might think I've deleted something and really want it to be deleted, and not realize that it's been caught and retained for 10 years or something behind the scenes. With files, however, you've got the same sort of choices, but you notice that we can choose to use retention labels to make content immutable at the point that it is labeled. And certainly when a label is applied to a file, what happens is, as a user, I can't even delete the file. It actually pops up a message in the corner and says, sorry, this is subject to retention. The key point to say here is while it is labeled, because it's very easy for a user to remove the label. As soon as they realize they can do that, they sort of can bypass this. So it's not foolproof, but at least they knowingly are then doing something wrong. What I often do is personally use retention labels to, when we're talking about files, to apply almost like the first stop, the catch that I want to make on the file to prevent people from doing something silly. And then you can apply a retention policy over files as well, almost as a safety net behind the scenes. At the end of retention, effectively content can be, that's in chats and posts, you've got two choices. You've got automatic deletion, which, as you can imagine, would be really useful to remove junk posts, junk chats, messages. Or the only other option you've got is do nothing. And honestly, I'm scratching my head. I don't see a scenario where you'd ever want to do nothing. But there's some glaring omissions here. There is no way with a retention policy of introducing a review or a transfer or an archive or anything like that. It is delete or do nothing. Now with files, effectively you've got the same two options, delete or do nothing, but you've got a third option, which is subject the file to a disposition review. And this basically means that you can choose to get an individual who's granted access to the disposition area to actually make an informed choice at the end of life. Notice there's no concept of, let's say, aggregation to group files together and make informed choice over multiple files. It's on an item-by-item basis. But hopefully that's given you an overview of the different ways that retention can be applied to chats and posts that can be applied to files. Sure, there'll be questions about that later. Right. Quickly jumping into sensitivity, I reckon I'm looking at the time as well. See, we've got 15 minutes left or so. So sensitivity, I won't dwell on this too long, but there's some concepts in Microsoft 365 that I think you should be aware of if you're not, around data loss prevention and sensitivity labels that effectively can be really powerful and can be applied to Teams as well as other parts of Microsoft 365. So, for example, data loss prevention can prevent the content from even being allowed to be shared or sent to certain groups of people. So you could say certain content that's highly sensitive, I'm going to even prevent it from being sent outside the organization altogether, for example, or prevent certain finance content or HR content being sent to anyone outside of that specific team. With sensitivity labels, you've got another level of control again, which effectively can be applied to your content in Teams. So you can, for example, it embeds control into the actual Office Suite file itself. So for example, you could have a Word document, let's say, and that Word document for specific groups of people, perhaps they are prevented from downloading it or printing it or forwarding it. So you've got lots of controls over how you manage that content. Just to give you one example of how Teams works with this, your video call. Let's say you're on a video call with lots of different people and some of those people do not have access to certain content. Teams is clever. Teams is aware that specific files might be something that you can see, but actually they're encrypted and other people do not have the rights to see them under the data loss protection policy that I mentioned before. And that actually, when you try and share a file, whether it's via the screen or whether it's actually the file itself, the video call actually in Teams goes, no, I recognize the sensitivity of this particular file, the fact that it's encrypted and certain people on the call can't see this, and prevents it from being shared via a video message. So it's really powerful when you start thinking about tools like that. Well, the first time I saw that, I was really quite gobsmacked. I didn't realize that Teams could do that for you. Anyway, let's move on from sensitivity. I guess almost to start the conclusion, what happens if you do nothing? If you just use Microsoft Teams out of the box from a governance perspective? Well, the architecture of Teams allows people to create teams, as it says on the box. Allows you to create teams and each one comes with a SharePoint site. But as I mentioned before, there's no real hierarchy. There's no real way of knowing who owns which parts of this mess that you're getting yourselves into. Yes, you can look at the owner, the named individual, but you're getting to a situation where from a top level view, once you start getting to a certain number of teams, how do I work out which part of the organization that belongs to? I think this is more of a challenge the bigger your organization is. If you've got 100 users, typically everyone knows each other. Typically everyone knows the purpose of each team, each SharePoint site. But if you're, I don't know, 1,000 users or 10,000 users, you can see, from a top level view, from a compliance perspective or from an IT perspective, looking down at a sea of hundreds or thousands of teams, it's going to be very difficult to work out who owns what, and not just who owns what value each of these has. Which of these teams that we're looking at here has valuable content in it that needs to be preserved? It's very difficult to see if you don't get the governance control in place from the off. And what does this do? Well, I'm not going to read through this list. I think they speak for themselves pretty much, but these types of problems rear their heads if you do nothing. I think certainly for a large or medium-sized organization, the do nothing option really is just going to be leading you to a position where you're in a mess in the future. Imagine the opening of Microsoft Teams in your organization, almost as if you were rolling back time to the 1980s and it was the very first file share that was rolled out, shared drive in your organization. And if you had the opportunity to get ahead of it and actually apply a structure to it. Now, for a small organization, it's fine. It's nice and easy to change that structure retrospectively. A big organization, I'm not speaking for all big organizations, but it's very hard to retrospectively take control. It becomes more difficult the longer it goes on. I'd urge you, certainly if you're in a large organization, to get control of this sooner rather than later. Now, what does get control mean? Well, the very first thing, if you only do one thing, I'd urge you to stop allowing people to self-service and self-create their own teams and SharePoint sites. You can't allow them to keep doing it. You'll end up with an exponential growth. I think the caveat to this again is, if you've got 30 people, 50 people in your organization, maybe you can trust them to do that. If you've got 1,000 people or 500 people, I don't think you can justify allowing them to keep creating teams and SharePoint sites without any governance in place. But of course, as soon as you remove that, people are going to start phoning up IT and saying, can I have a team, please? So you need to replace that with a process for requesting new teams. I would suggest having some form of approval process for new teams and SharePoint sites, and then some form of creation process to build those teams and sites out. And that creation process could, of course, include all of the concepts we've talked about today, things such as naming conventions, retention, default metadata, structures, permissions, etc., could all be baked into that creation. And when we look at this process, at its simplest, it could be entirely manual. This could be a request that's made through a help desk system or something, or just an email that basically then gets an approval from a line manager, doesn't even need the approval, and the creation could be manual. And the bigger the organization is, the more that becomes quite onerous as a process, and the more you want to automate this through business process, streaming into some form of automated provisioning at the back end of this to create consistent workspaces, teams, and sites. And what does that look like? Well, in the concept of SharePoint, you can have hubs, in this case, structuring your SharePoint content, and you can imagine a situation where a new SharePoint site that's requested is appended to an existing hub. In the concept of Teams, you could imagine how suddenly you've got a situation where you've got a consistent naming prefix, let's say by business unit or department or college or whatever type of organization you are. You could almost imagine it being the situation where you could give delegated owners, let's say the owner of a specific business unit, a WYSI function that basically provides them with a list of all of their teams based upon that consistent naming convention. In other words, find me a list of all of the groups that start with this three-letter code or something, and that would give them a way that they've actually, for the first time, got an overview of everything they're meant to be responsible for. Otherwise, things typically will get orphaned. Likewise, you could choose to have templates for different types of teams. Project teams versus department teams might have different retention, different structures, etc. It's really all about defining those ways of working, the different patterns that you see in your organization. I can see we've only got a few minutes of questions, so I'm going to wind up quickly. I was just going to seed the thought of two different sort of concepts of teams, and I don't know which is better, but I see some organizations seeing teams almost as only for temporary use, just for projects, and others arguing that they should be used both for temporary projects and short-term initiatives, and also for the longer-term initiatives, departments, the perpetual entities, because of course the functionality that comes with the teams, the collaboration, the wall, etc., actually can benefit both. But I guess it really, from a retention point of view, is the difference is, do you archive in situ in your team, and that's perfectly valid with the retention features we looked at, or do you have a life cycle where certain types of team come to an end of their life cycle, get archived to one extent or another, and perhaps the content of more value is moved elsewhere to be stored in a more permanent place, perhaps in SharePoint. Anyway, should we start looking through some of the questions?
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you, Robert. That was a great session, extremely insightful. We have lots of questions. Before I get started in the questions, just a quick reminder, if you haven't already completed the poll, please take the last few minutes of this webinar to do that. It won't be available after the webinar has ended. So in terms of questions, and the very first question that we have from Paula, do you know of any major changes towards Teams in regards to the new updates Microsoft are rolling out in July this year, affecting both policies and labels for SharePoint Online and OneDrive?
Off the top of my head, no. What I'll do, Paula, is I'll look that up, see if I can find any information about that coming out. I'm assuming you're primarily talking about the new records management tool that's just reached production, or you could be sort of inferring some of the Cortex changes that are coming through in July as well. And obviously there's going to be lots of different impact across the environment, but I don't know of any that are specific to Teams. I'll take that away. What I'll do with all these questions, by the way, is whether I answer them or not, I'm going to incorporate them into a blog post that I'm going to make sure is available in the IRMS site that people can find and read up on those answers in their own time. Excellent.
Thanks, Robert. So those are, I guess, more of a statement rather than a question. Gillian said, is it possible to get a podcast of this? A few of us here keep getting disconnected, and I've responded to Gillian. For those of you who can see that, this session is being recorded and it will be available to view immediately after the session is up using the exact same link that you used to access this webinar. It will also be put on the IRMS YouTube channel, and I'll be sharing the link to that via email once it's up. So next question from Sean. As it isn't possible for a user to individually delete one-on-one and group chats, having a retention policy for them seems really important. Is there a view on the length of time it is appropriate to keep chats for and then blanket delete, and or a view on what one-on-one and group chats should be used for? So two seemingly separate questions there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really, consultant answer, it really depends what you're using the group chat for. So firstly, I think it's probably useful, certainly in some situations, to restrict what you're using the group chat for. So let's say you are using it for talking about recruitment. Perhaps it's not the right place to be mentioning individuals. I'm thinking about freedom of information and, you know, SARS, etc., and that could well impact that going forwards and just make it complicated for you to fulfill those requests. But obviously, in terms of the length of retention, I can imagine some situations where you almost decide that for a certain type of team, let's say a project, I'm just using that as an example, you might well have a very short retention on chats and almost say, okay, no, everything gets deleted down almost by retention, by retention policy on a timely basis, just because that's, you know, that works in this context. But obviously you can't do that where the information that's stored in the chat is something that you need to retain or need to preserve as an organization. So I'm not sure you could apply that blanket across your entire organization, even though it'd be nice from a freedom of information perspective to be able to delete things down. It's going to be contextual based upon what value that content actually contains. And if you can train your staff to perhaps not put the content of value in the conversation and put the content of value in the document, then great. It really, that will depend on what I mean by value, the content of value, and what your staff understand that to mean as well. So again, it's going to be very situational depending on what specific way of working you're talking about. I hope that sort of answers the question.
Excellent, thanks, Rob. Next question from Aldo. Hi, thanks for the presentation, really interesting. Apologies if you said it and I missed it. Does any difference apply to retention period for viewing, recording of meetings in Teams?
To the best of my knowledge, Aldo, no. So my understanding is that when you've created a video in Teams, a recording of a meeting, effectively it gets uploaded into Stream. And the last time I looked, and shout if I'm wrong here, because I might not have the latest information on this. Last time I looked, I've been waiting for retention to be applied to Stream for a while now. And last time I looked, it still wasn't available. It wouldn't shock me if it becomes available soon, though, because, you know, it's an obvious sort of content store in Microsoft 365 that certainly last time I looked, it wasn't subject to retention. That doesn't mean, of course, that you have to leave the file in Stream. I mean, it's the best place for streaming the file from, but there's no harm potentially in removing it from Stream and uploading it somewhere that is subject to retention. Let's say a SharePoint library or a different storage area altogether, where you could apply different retention to it.
Okay, next question from Tanbir. What's the key advantage of MS Team over a SharePoint site for collaboration?
Well, I guess it all brings everything into one space. So it's the fact you can have a conversation in situ around the content. I mean, if your users are happy, you know, if you're primarily working in files and you supplement the files with just instant messages or something, then perhaps you don't need the function that Teams, part of Teams, brings to the story. But yeah, to me, it provides a really tight sort of workspace for people to remember, you know, to go to. And if that's almost the primary place that people start looking for content, they're probably going to be able to find it more easily than if they're dancing between, I don't know, Exchange and moving over to SharePoint and then looking at file stores, etc. It almost surfaces it in one place. I guess the benefit from a collaboration point of view is reduced in scenarios where people have multiple ways of working and some of your content's still in Exchange and some of it's in you know, other places. And I noticed that several people at Microsoft have actually actively said, no, I'm not responding to emails and disabling their email addresses to encourage people to ping them messages on Teams so that it's all in one space, so that they know where their content is. I think it really is going to depend on organisation to organisation how they approach that.
Excellent. We have, I should have jumped to this before, a leading question from Sean based on Aldo's earlier question. So building on Aldo's question, is there advice about governance for recordings more generally? For example, is it possible to redact from recordings?
Well, from my perspective, I'm primarily a Microsoft 365 chap, as opposed to going to pretend to be having, coming from that sort of pure retention basis. So I can't really provide you the expertise that a records manager would in terms of answering this question. But I don't think there's anything in Stream itself that will allow you to edit the file in situ. Having said that, I believe you can obviously download the file and redact it with there's various different MP4 editors, etc., that will allow you to take out a whole 5-minute clip or something from the middle of a video, if useful, and then re-upload it. So I guess that's not a direct answer to your question, but of course there's ways of redacting videos. I don't think they're in Stream itself. The one feature of Stream that I love, by the way, it's not answering this question at all, but the one feature I absolutely love is the automated text. So as you speak, it listens to the words it can hear in the video and gives you the transcript automatically. And not only does it give you the transcript in Stream, it allows you to search that transcript. So if you're in the middle of a video, if someone speaking references a certain keyword, they say orange or something, it will, in the transcript of the video, tag it with, orange. And when you search for orange, it finds that video and finds not just the video, it finds the specific few seconds of the video where you mention that thing. So that could be really powerful from a collaboration point of view. Again, it brings its own issues from a governance point of view that need to be considered in terms of how easy it is to find when people say something now through search.
There's a comment in the on the chat section, sorry, okay. From David, and he said you can trim the file in situ.
Oh, brilliant! It's good to hear. Okay. Cheers, though.
Excellent. Okay, so we'll move on. Last 2 questions. So Niall has said, what are some pros and cons for advocating use of Microsoft Teams for online video meetings versus, say, Zoom or others?
Well, I'm biased. I love, from an online call perspective, the company I work for, Intelogy, has been using Teams exclusively now pretty much 4 months. And honestly, the quality of the calls, even with people's home broadband to put up with multiple people involved in the calls, is really powerful. It's been great. It's been incredibly reliable. And the quality of the video and clarity of the conversation, I think, has been superb. That said, we're using a different technology right now, Livestorm. And certainly from my point of view, it's worked pretty well, certainly in Chrome, and it seems to be a very good way of distributing, webinars like this. I guess the difference primarily is that Teams it gives you more control because it's locked into your enterprise, it's into your organization. So in theory, you could, your IT team have more control over who they share, who they allow in. Now you can obviously allow external people in, but it's not really designed for something like this webinar, for example. It's not really designed, I guess something like Zoom doesn't have any real governance or controls around it. You can start inviting almost anyone in. And of course, I've not played extensively with Zoom, so I can't really critique it. But certainly the experience I've got with Teams call functionality is that it's really very good. But perhaps that's my bias showing. I don't know.
We as an organisation use Zoom as our primary video conferencing facilities, especially more so now since the lockdown, I think, as opposed to our usual. We have a web conferencing function, which doesn't always work so well when we have a number of people on it. I've found Zoom to be really good. Recently, they have made some changes to their privacy, and so they've added on the functionality to add on a password. So the password is required each time you join a Zoom meeting. Some of the functionality can be quite different to other web conferencing facilities that I've used. There doesn't seem to be as much control in the way of organising the way the session starts and ends. Bit like you can on Livestorm and for Microsoft Teams.
Mm-hmm. It's useful. Okay. I'm not that familiar with Zoom, I have to admit. So I'd like to learn more. Perhaps we should continue this conversation sometime.
Yeah. Okay. So next question from Mark. Great presentation, Rob. My question is whether there are any example retention policies and labels that are now being used by organisations for the various Office 365 workloads that could be shared with the IRMS community.
Hi, Mark. I guess it's a bit like the file plans. You know, each organisation, there's shared sort of file plans so that, you know, organisations can almost build a retention scheme that's almost shared, if you like. But each organisation, naturally, by the nature of the fact they're doing something slightly different, is going to have their own granularity in terms of retention schedule. And likewise, I think I'm seeing patterns, but I wouldn't say there's anything that's easy to share. So you do have similar conversations time after time, but each organisation has their own view on what they want to make into, you know, how they want to apply retention. Some want to almost have a much more granular system of labels that reflects the sort of functional activity that's going on in the organisation. Some really want to streamline it right down to a subset that's almost abstracted away. So, for example, using much more, perhaps only 10 labels for the entire organisation, for example. I guess there isn't, as such, I can't really, there's nothing to really share, because some of these patterns, for example, a good pattern that I've seen is in OneDrive. Some organizations are happier with OneDrive than others, but those who are less happy with people storing their information in OneDrive, simply because when they leave the organization, unless you intercept it, OneDrive gets deleted by default. So you lose anything that's in OneDrive. And really, OneDrive is a silo of information. It's, you know, it's a personal storage location, but how do you encourage people to use it as such? So organizations that want to encourage personal use and discourage sharing, let's say, of content in OneDrive and it becoming a content store of its own sort of place, a collaboration space, often use retention to almost enforce deletion by default of content in OneDrive unless people knowingly start saying, no, this is actually something I need to preserve. It's not really an answer to your question, but you get the idea, I hope. It really depends on the organisation and how they want to apply. So I don't think there's much to share, really, from that point of view.
Excellent. Last question from Sean. Do you know whether the recent license changes mean that e-discovery for chat and channel messages is now available for E3?
I hate licensing questions. You know, the licensing is a dark art in Microsoft. I don't think anyone actually understands it. And every time I say anything definitive, I look behind my back and find the opposite's true. So obviously, I don't know is the honest question. What I'll do is I'll answer that question in more depth when I write up the answers to these questions in a blog.
Okay, great. And that ends the questions. We've had a comment in the chat section from Jenny. My organisation is E3 and we don't have it. So.
Cool. That's bad news, I guess, but at least it's a definitive answer.
Yeah. Okay, we ran over ever so slightly by 7 minutes. Thank you so much, Robert, for a brilliant session. Extremely insightful. Lots of really useful hints and tips. Lots of comments in the chat section with people saying thank you for a great session. So well received. The recording, as I said earlier, will be available to view immediately after this session has ended, using the exact same link that you used to access the webinar, and it'll also be put up on the IRMS YouTube channel. If you have any questions or comments or any feedback, please don't hesitate to email either myself or Rob. Rob's email address is up on the slide on the screen, and my email address is north@irms.org.uk.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to try and answer anything.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks everyone and have a great rest of the day.